I'm back with slightly better camera, and this is probably the one we're going to stick to for a little while until I can secure another one. This is King Bobby of Integrity Nation. Today we are going to talk about actions of Canada in a well-known and ongoing case which got all branches of government involved. I'm going to discuss the matter ahead of those very ugly developments with which I have intimate familiarity, since case of Meng Wanzhou has been well covered and debated. If you pay at least a little bit of attention to news ticker, trade, or politics, you are probably familiar with its details. Canadian conduct in this case resembles negotiation of counterfeit banknotes for real services or merchandise. Justice Heather Holmes acted as a seller. She released to Mr. Trudeau and his thugs what they wanted, whilst being fully aware that they're paying with funny money. Guess what? None of them is in jail. Okay, let's pull up and examine this endorsement on double criminality. As the title implies, facts must add up to an offense in Canada. Feel free to fetch and examine your own copy. There are many redundancies in the document as the same issues are approached from perspective of different case law. However, it's all plain and simple. Presented facts don't add up to fraud as the so-called Queen Elizabeth II and her dog Justin Trudeau purport. Even serving at the time as ambassador to China, Mr. John McCallum knew that arrest of men on the alleged grounds is ridiculous, for which he was forced into resignation because Trudeau had an agenda. Back to the endorsement. We are not going to venture into details of the US allegations and whether Ms. Mann indeed violated the US sanctions law and did it willfully, as it's alleged. We don't have enough information, and it's not necessary for us to know that. Apparently, the US is planning to argue that the jure setup isn't reflective of the facto situation on the ground. For us, it's enough to know that the sanctions don't exist in Canada, thus there can be no match in offense and double criminality. And you see that essentially judge and prosecutors actually second that, so that's the fact. This is where Justin Trudeau went on to cook books, as it's called in accounting. The crooked monarch went on to pass the facts for fraud by exploiting allegations that men misrepresented to HSBC and led by it banking consortium her relationship with Skycom, and ultimately knowing that Skycom is merely a front for disguising genuine recipient of US sourced equipment. In fraud, the issue of explicit lie is actually collateral consideration. Knowledge of material falsehood is all which is needed. In fact, if someone at HSBC hasn't read Skycom related allegations published in a newspaper, they would probably never do any inquiries. Obviously, the sanctions law would be violated by virtue of supplying prohibited equipment to Iran, not whether that was accompanied by the alleged lies. For similar considerations, it's not really relevant where the alleged lies took place. The bankers did what they did in order to make sure that they have done due diligence by questioning men, whether there is any substance behind the published allegations. While the bankers' primary concern was to make sure that the published allegations don't stick to them as known to them violation of the sanctions, they also in a sense acted as agents of the United States. Imagine a US official being in place of bankers and asking the same questions. Thus, any uttered lie would be directed at the United States. Here we come to foundation for claiming fraud as equivalent offense. It's a bizarre claim that falsehood behind the alleged lies put banks and HSBC specifically at risk of prosecution for violation of the sanctions regime. Look, it's all so basic. Imagine you being an Uber driver and it turned out that you unknowingly gave ride to someone who was on the way to commit a heinous robbery. Are you a participant? Are you complicit by virtue of giving the ride? Obviously no. Unless you are a co-conspirator, you haven't violated anything. There would be no basis for prosecuting you for the robbery. You might be asked questions as a witness will. Do you appreciate the type of nonsense crooked Elizabeth II and her vassals would push through? Fake basis for the claimed fraud. Claim that the banks were duped into servicing transactions is actually negative of them becoming subject to prosecution. Ironically, they admitted that Canada conducts arbitrary prosecutions. Elizabeth II, Trudeau, Lametti, Justice Holmes, government attorneys testify that Canada will be prosecuting people simply for association, even when unfortunate one, rather than committing a crime. Are we credible witnesses in that? We must be. We are insiders after all. We tell that victims of fraud are and will be re-victimized by Canadians. That's horrendous and unthinkable. Falsehood must be material. It's not just some falsehood or willing it lie. Some may not like Iran and balk at any trade with it, but in Canada it's not a material falsehood. In some cases, a party cannot even refuse services, as some bakers did by refusing to make a cake for a gay wedding. Obviously, the gays wouldn't be prosecuted of defrauding bakers, even if they had to lie to get around the stubbornness, in order to get the cake and avoid derailing the wedding. There is no explanation for Mr. Lametti claiming nonsense mentioned in paragraph 51, since the whole conversation was about trade with Iran. It was just a matter of whether that trade violates unilaterally imposed by the United States sanctions. I guess the situation is twofold. Since the attorneys act with impunity, they don't really care which nonsense sticks. At the same time, if something gets rejected, as it happened to the submission, the rejection would contribute to false perceptions of justice and fairness. Yeah, something got rejected. You see, it's fair hearing, which really doesn't say anything about fairness or merits. Observe that the United States took legislative steps to establish materiality of alleged falsehood. Canada hasn't done so. Essentially, Trudeau, employed by him attorneys and the judicial executives, surrendered sovereignty and the so-called Canadian values. It feels that unmitigated scams the actual Canadian value. For all practical purposes, Meng is allegedly a dissident. She is just not a Chinese dissident, but an American dissident when it comes to law. What are chances of Canada arresting and sending Hong Kong dissidents back to China on basis of them lying to someone in order to practice their dissent? Zero, if we trust communications out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What is different in case of Meng then? At this point you probably think, Gish, I should be capable of assessing materiality property for this and that in a defined context. And you will be absolutely correct. It's not domain exclusive to judges. Here we come to the fact of Canadians having defrauded Meng. She relied on representations made by Canada and then became victim of bait and switch scheming. The whole proceeding essentially turned into manufacturing of wheel around forgery of materiality property for made allegations. These things are called accounting frauds, even though this is not about accounting for money, as it's case in commerce. The point is that in business world, executives with knowledge analogous of that exhibited by the judge would be convicted of fraud. Meanwhile, you will notice that nobody was even chastised. This is reality of Canadian values and brutality. Her evilness Elizabeth II does run kangaroo courts. That's the real face of Trudeau and company, unmasked. Their acts don't match their propaganda. This example alone shows that Canada's courts are not independent and attorneys act with intent to exploit that. Even when that plan doesn't work out, nobody is held accountable for attempts to negotiate falsehood and terrorizing people. By the way, I did write a complaint to Canadian Judicial Council. Let's see what happens, but my experience with them isn't good. Crooked organization. In terms of police brutality, police palpably doesn't protect from crime. Canadian police, in this case represented by RCMP, breaches trust. It's a co-conspirator in the crimes. Meanwhile, Vancouver police watches that nobody even dares to disrupt crimes in progress. As you see, Canada was caught red-handed. Elizabeth II's House of Windsor was caught red-handed. Isn't it time to dissolve this criminal organization? Meng case is not an exception. These horrors are everyday reality. Integrity Nation is going to reveal more details. Hit like and subscribe if you stand for integrity. Should the nation move against the criminals? How do we organize? Use comments to share your thoughts. Talk to you later.